Donald Trump gets kicked out of a motel by mistake, but when he revealed who he was, the owner fainted. The day had started normally enough for Donald Trump. He'd been in Pittsburgh for a series of private business meetings, the kind that still demanded his personal attention despite his post-presidential status. The morning sky had been clear, promising an easy return to Mar-a-Lago that evening. None of the weather reports had hinted at the monster storm system that would soon engulf the entire region. "Sir, we might want to consider postponing the takeoff," his pilot, Captain Reynolds, had suggested during their pre-flight briefing. "These new weather patterns look concerning." Trump had waved off the concern with his characteristic confidence. "We've flown through worse, much worse. Tremendous storms, really, and we always made it through. Always." Looking back, as he now gripped the steering wheel of his Suburban in a white-knuckled death grip, he wished he'd listened to Reynolds. The emergency landing at a small regional airport had been harrowing enough. But now, separated from his security detail and with a dead phone, he found himself driving through the Pennsylvania backroads in what felt like biblical rain. "Absolutely ridiculous," he muttered to himself, squinting through the windshield where the wipers were fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Completely ridiculous situation. His mind wandered back to the chaos at the small airport. The tension in Reynolds' voice when he'd announced they needed to land immediately. The scramble to find ground transportation when it became clear they couldn't wait out the storm. The gradual realization that his usual security detail, traveling in separate vehicles, had somehow gotten separated from him in the confusion. "Sir, I really must insist you wait for backup," his head of security had said during their last phone conversation before Trump's phone battery gave up the ghost. "We're less than an hour behind you." "Listen, Bob," Trump had replied, already sliding behind the wheel of the Suburban, "I've got meetings tomorrow morning, important meetings. I can't sit around in some tiny airport all night. I'll drive myself. Done it before, you know, many times." That had been 3 hours ago. Since then, he'd watched his phone battery drain to nothing, taken at least 2 wrong turns, and now found himself on a pitch-black stretch of rural highway with no idea where exactly he was. A flash of lightning illuminated a road sign. "Welcome to Pine Grove, population 2,187. "Pine Grove," Trump repeated, tasting the unfamiliar name. "Never heard of it, never heard of it." The rain intensified, if that was even possible. Through the curtain of water, he barely made out the shapes of small buildings, a gas station, its lights off for the night, a diner with a single car in the parking lot, a hardware store with plywood over one window. His stomach growled, reminding him that his last meal had been a hurried lunch in Pittsburgh. He was tired, hungry, and increasingly aware that he was in a situation far outside his usual sphere of experience. Donald Trump didn't do small towns. He didn't do emergencies without his usual support system. And he certainly didn't do budget motels, which is exactly what he saw looming ahead through the rain. The Pine Grove Motel, its neon vacancy sign flickering weakly in the storm. For a long moment, he sat in the idling Suburban, staring at the motel through the rain-streaked windshield. The place had clearly seen better days. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through. A Coca-Cola vending machine stood sentry near the office, its light providing a sad red glow. Of the dozen or so rooms, only 2 showed lights behind their curtained windows. "This is temporary," he told himself firmly. "Just until morning, just until the team catches up." He pulled into a parking space near the office, the Suburban's tires crunching over scattered gravel. Another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Trump jumped slightly in his seat, then immediately felt foolish for doing so. Taking a deep breath, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. The familiar feel of the soft leather was somehow reassuring. He flipped it open, counting the cash inside, a little over $300. He rarely carried cash these days. It was just luck he'd gotten some at the airport. "Okay," he said to himself, squaring his shoulders. "Okay, let's do this." The distance from the Suburban to the motel office was maybe 30 feet. but in the driving rain, it might as well have been a mile. Trump made a half-hearted attempt to protect his hair with his suit jacket, but it was a lost cause. By the time he pushed open the office door, triggering a tinny bell overhead, he was thoroughly soaked. The office was small and dated, with wood-paneled walls and a worn linoleum floor. A desk fan oscillated slowly in one corner, stirring the humid air. Behind the counter, Marion Wells sat in a worn office chair, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she worked on a crossword puzzle. The small TV mounted in the corner was playing an old episode of Wheel of Fortune, the volume turned low. Marion glanced up briefly at the sound of the bell, then returned to her puzzle. "Need a room?" she asked, not really looking at the drenched man before her. Trump stood there dripping on the linoleum, water running from his normally carefully styled hair down his face. "Yes," he said, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. "Yes, I need a room." "Single or double?" Marion asked, still focused on her crossword. "Single is fine," Trump replied, running a hand through his wet hair in a futile attempt to arrange it. Marion finally looked up, squinting slightly through her bifocals. In the fluorescent office lighting, with his hair plastered to his head and his expensive suit soaking wet, Trump bore little resemblance to his usual polished appearance. To Marion, he was just another traveler caught in the storm. $65, she said, reaching for her registration book. "Cash only. Card reader's been down since Tuesday." Trump pulled out his wallet again, extracting 3 20s and a 5. "Is there somewhere to get food around here?" "Diner down the street closes at 10. Marion said, glancing at the clock on the wall. "It's 1:15. Vending machine outside has snacks. There's a microwave here in the office if you need it." As she spoke, she pushed a registration card across the counter. "Need you to fill this out. Print clearly, please." Trump stared at the card for a moment. For the first time in years, he was going to have to write down his name without causing a stir. Part of him was tempted to use a pseudonym, but he didn't want to risk any complications when his security team finally caught up with him. "Pen?" he asked. Marion passed him a ballpoint pen with Pine Grove Motel printed on the side. Trump began filling out the card, his handwriting surprisingly neat despite his exhaustion. "Coming from far?" Marion asked, making minimal effort at small talk. "Pittsburgh," Trump replied, continuing to write. "Plane had to make an emergency landing. Storm." Marion nodded. "Bad night for flying. Bad night for driving, too." Trump finished the registration card and slid it back across the counter. Marion picked it up, glancing at it automatically. Her eyes moved across the information without really registering it. "Room 114, she said, reaching for a key attached to a large plastic keychain. "Down at the end. Parking right in front. Remotes on the TV, extra towels in the bathroom. Checkouts at 11. Trump took the key, its weight unfamiliar in his hand. When was the last time he'd used an actual key for a hotel room? "Thank you," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. As he turned to leave, Marion's voice stopped him. "Mr. Trump?" She was looking at the registration card again, this time actually reading it. Trump tensed slightly, waiting for the usual reaction, but Marion just shook her head slightly, as if dismissing a thought. "Breakfast place opens at 6, she said. 2 blocks down on the right, better than the diner." Trump nodded and pushed back out into the rain. In the office behind him, Marion returned to her crossword puzzle, the TV continuing to murmur in the background. Neither of them knew that by this time tomorrow, this unremarkable exchange would become the talk of the nation. Making his way to room 114, Trump couldn't help but notice the details of his surroundings: the peeling paint on the door frames, the rusty air conditioning units mounted under each window, the faint smell of old cigarette smoke that lingered despite the no-smoking signs. It was a world away from Trump Tower, from Mar-a-Lago, from the luxury he'd grown accustomed to over his lifetime. The key stuck slightly in the lock before turning with a loud click. Trump pushed open the door to room 114 and felt along the wall for a light switch. A single ceiling fixture flickered to life, illuminating a room that seemed frozen in time somewhere around 1985. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, the carpet a worn beige. A small desk stood against one wall, its surface scarred with cigarette burns despite the no-smoking policy. The TV was an older model mounted on a metal bracket, its remote indeed sitting on top as Marion had said. Trump set his wet jacket on the back of the desk chair and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. The springs creaked under his weight. Reaching for his phone out of habit, he remembered again that it was dead. The room had no phone, probably removed years ago when cell phones became universal. Just until morning, he reminded himself again, lying back on the bed without even removing his shoes. Just until morning. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain drumming against the window and roof. Thunder rolled across the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a car alarm started wailing. But inside room 114 of the Pine Grove Motel, Donald Trump, former President of the United States, was already drifting off to sleep, unaware that the most surprising part of his adventure was yet to come. The last thought that crossed his mind before sleep took him was a strange one. He couldn't remember the last time he'd fallen asleep in a room where absolutely nobody knew where he was. It was both terrifying and oddly liberating. In the morning, everything would return to normal. The security teams would arrive, the phones would work again, and this strange interlude would become just another story to tell. But for now, in this small motel in this small town, he was just another traveler waiting out the storm, and somehow that was okay. The night proved restless. Trump woke several times, each instance taking a moment to remember where he was. Around 3 in the morning, he sat up fully, his stomach growling in protest of the missed dinner. The storm outside had settled into a steady drumming of rain, less violent but persistent. He switched on the bedside lamp, its weak light casting strange shadows on the wood-paneled walls. A water stain on the ceiling caught his eye. It vaguely resembled Florida, which only made him miss Mar-a-Lago more acutely. "This place," he muttered, standing up and walking to the window. "This place is something else." Pulling back the thin curtain, he peered into the parking lot. His Suburban sat alone under the flickering neon light, water cascading off its black surface. No sign of his security team yet. The thought made him uncomfortable. He couldn't remember the last time he'd gone this long without protection. The vending machine Marion had mentioned glowed red in the darkness. His stomach growled again, more insistently this time. "Fine," he said to himself, fishing in his wallet for singles. "Fine, we'll do it your way." The walk to the vending machine was brief but wet. Trump stood before it, scanning the options with the critical eye of someone who usually had personal chefs at his beck and call. Rows of candy bars, chips, and cookies stared back at him. "Excuse me?" The voice startled him. Trump turned to find a young man in a rain jacket, probably in his early 20s, holding an umbrella. "You're the guy from 114, right?" the young man asked. "Just wanted to check if everything's okay. Saw your light on." It was Tyler, Marion's grandson, doing his regular night rounds, but Trump didn't know that yet. "Everything's fine," Trump replied, turning back to the vending machine. "Just getting some food." Tyler lingered, something about the guest's behavior striking him as odd. The expensive suit, now rumpled, the way he stood, the way he spoke, something wasn't quite right. "We get a lot of people stuck here because of storms," Tyler offered, trying to sound casual. "Where'd you say you were headed?" "I didn't," Trump responded, feeding $1 into the machine. The bill was rejected. He smoothed it against the machine's edge and tried again. Tyler watched as the obviously wealthy man struggled with the vending machine. "Sometimes you have to hit it on the side," he suggested, "right there by the coin return." Trump looked at him for a moment, then gave the machine a half-hearted tap. The dollar went in smoothly this time. "Thanks," Trump said, punching in the code for a package of peanut butter crackers. "You work here?" "Sort of. My grandmother owns the place. I help out sometimes, keep an eye on things." Tyler shifted his weight, still watching Trump carefully. "You make any calls from your room earlier?" "We had some complaints about noise." Trump turned to face him fully now. Calls? My phone's dead. There's no charger in the room. Right, Tyler said slowly, clearly not believing him. Well, if you need anything, there's a number for the office by the bed. Have a good night, sir. As Tyler walked away, Trump could feel the young man's suspicion. It was an unfamiliar sensation. People usually either recognized him immediately or treated him with deference due to his obvious wealth and bearing. This kind of suspicion was new. Back in his room, Trump sat on the bed with his crackers, the packaging crinkling loudly in the quiet room. The clock on the bedside table read 3:27 a.m. Outside, he could hear Tyler's footsteps passing by his window, slower now, deliberate. Unbelievable, Trump murmured, brushing cracker crumbs from his lap. Just unbelievable. He tried the TV, but the reception was poor, the images ghosting and fuzzing. The few clear channels seemed to be playing infomercials or religious programming. He settled on a televangelist, more for the company of another voice than any interest in the message. Sleep seemed impossible now. Trump paced the small room, 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. The carpet was worn thin in a path near the bed, suggesting many others had paced here before him, trapped by storms or circumstances or both. His thoughts drifted to his team, probably still searching for him in this weather. To his meetings tomorrow, today, really, that would have to be rescheduled. To the headlines that would inevitably appear once this story got out. Trump spends night in budget motel. The late-night comedians would have a field day. A car passed on the highway, its headlights sweeping across his room through the thin curtains. For a moment, Trump thought it might be his security team, but the sound of the engine faded into the distance. He checked his phone again, a futile gesture. The black screen reflected his face, and he was struck by how different he looked. His hair, usually carefully styled, had dried in strange patterns. His tie hung loosely around his neck, his shirt wrinkled beyond saving. Should have listened to Reynolds, he said to his reflection. Should have just waited it out. The televangelist's voice rose in passion, and Trump turned the TV off. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the continuing rain and the occasional drip from the bathroom faucet. He went to the bathroom, flicking on the harsh fluorescent light. The fixtures were old but clean. The complimentary soap was wrapped in paper bearing the motel's name. Trump unwrapped it, the familiar motions of washing his hands providing a small comfort of normalcy. Looking in the mirror, he attempted to fix his hair with his fingers, but it was hopeless without his usual products. For the first time in years, he looked ordinary. Not the businessman, not the president, not the celebrity, just a tired traveler in a small-town motel. A loud bang from somewhere outside made him jump, probably just the ice machine, he told himself, but he moved to the window anyway, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. Tyler was making another round, this time talking on a phone. Even through the rain-streaked window, Trump could see the concern on the young man's face. He was gesturing toward room 114, toward Trump's room. This could be a problem, Trump muttered, letting the curtain fall back into place. This could be a real problem. The morning light crept reluctantly through the thin curtains of the Pine Grove Motel. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the gray dawn sky. Tyler Wells pulled into the parking lot at exactly 6:45 a.m., just like he did every morning, but today something felt different. "Morning, Grandma," he called out as he entered the office, shaking water from his jacket. "Any excitement last night?" Marion looked up from her fresh crossword puzzle, adjusting her reading glasses. Just the storm, and that late check-in in 114. Tyler's expression darkened. "Yeah, about him." He pulled up a chair to the counter, lowering his voice despite the empty office. "Did you notice anything weird about that guy?" "Weird how?" Marion asked, setting down her pen. "He was soaking wet, paid cash. Nothing too unusual about that." "I did my rounds last night," Tyler said, leaning forward. 3 times I heard him talking in his room. Loud talking, Grandma. Important-sounding stuff about meetings and security clearances, and God knows what else." Marion frowned. "Could have been the TV." TV reception was out most of the night because of the storm. Tyler ran a hand through his hair, a habit he'd picked up from his late father. And get this, he told me his phone was dead, but I heard him talking. Something's not right. Tyler James Wells, Marion said, using his full name in that way grandmothers do. Are you suggesting we've got some kind of criminal in 114? I'm suggesting we need to be careful. Tyler stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Suburban parked outside room 114. That's a government vehicle if I've ever seen one. Black Suburban, tinted windows. And did you actually look at his registration card? Marion reached for the registration book, flipping it open to the previous night's entries. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the name. Donald Trump? Like the… Exactly, Tyler cut in. Either we've got the real Donald Trump in our motel, which, come on, that's ridiculous, or we've got someone using his name. Either way, something's fishy. Marion chewed her lower lip thoughtfully. Well, he paid cash. That's another red flag, Tyler exclaimed. Guy shows up in an expensive suit, driving a car like that, but can only pay cash? In 2024, who doesn't have a credit card? The card reader's broken, Marion reminded him. Grandma, please. Tyler returned to the counter. Remember that guy last year? The one who turned out to be running from his wife's divorce lawyers? He seemed normal too. And that couple that was writing bad checks all over the state? We can't be too careful. Marion nodded slowly. Her grandson had good instincts. He'd proven that more than once. And there was something odd about the whole situation. So what do you want to do? I say we ask him to leave, Tyler said firmly. Better safe than sorry. If he's legitimate, he'll understand. If he's not… A noise from outside interrupted them. Through the office window, they could see their mysterious guest emerging from room 114. Trump had attempted to restore some order to his appearance, but without his usual grooming products and with his suit still wrinkled from sleeping in it, he cut an unusual figure in the morning light. Look at him, Tyler whispered. Does that look like a normal person to you? Trump was pacing in front of his room, periodically checking his phone and shaking his head. His hair caught the morning light in a way that made it almost glow. Maybe we should call the police, Marion suggested, but her voice was uncertain. And tell them what? We've got a guest who talks too much and has weird hair? Tyler shook his head. No, we handle this ourselves. Quick and clean, before anything happens. Marion watched as Trump walked to his car, opened the door, then closed it again without getting in. He looked frustrated, confused, not at all like the confident figure she remembered from television. Not that she was willing to entertain the idea that it could actually be him. The whole thing was too absurd. Okay, she said finally, but be professional about it. No accusations, no confrontations. Just tell him we need the room and refund his money. Tyler was already heading for the door. Don't worry, Grandma, I've got this. Tyler, she called after him, be careful. Outside, Trump had resumed his pacing. The morning air was heavy with moisture from the storm, and somewhere in the distance, a car alarm was still going off. He looked up as Tyler approached, and for a moment, their eyes met. Good morning, Trump said, trying to sound casual. Any chance you've got a phone charger I could borrow? Tyler squared his shoulders. Actually, sir, we need to talk about your stay here. Trump's expression shifted slightly. He'd seen that look before, the look of someone working up their courage to confront him. But usually, it was over politics or business deals, not whatever this was. Is there a problem? Trump asked, his voice taking on that familiar, commanding tone that had served him so well in boardrooms and rallies. Several problems, actually. Tyler was trying to keep his voice steady, professional. We've had some concerns about unusual activity from your room last night. Unusual activity? Trump repeated, genuinely confused. I was sleeping, when I wasn't trying to get that vending machine to work. Sir, we heard you making multiple phone calls, despite claiming your phone was dead. Tyler took a step forward. And your registration? Well, that raises some questions too. Trump's face began to redden. Questions? What questions? Sir, if you're not willing to be honest about your identity. Honest? Trump's voice rose slightly. You want to talk about honest? Marion, watching from the office window, saw the confrontation escalating and hurried outside. The morning air was cool on her face as she approached the two men. Is everything all right out here? She asked, trying to sound calm. No, everything is not all right, Trump said, turning to face her. Your employee here is suggesting I'm being dishonest? Sir, Tyler pressed on, we just need you to leave. We'll refund your payment, but you need to go. Now. A car pulled into the motel parking lot, and for a moment, Trump thought his security team had finally arrived. But it was just an elderly couple, probably looking for breakfast directions. They slowed down to watch the scene unfolding in front of room 114. This is ridiculous, Trump muttered, then louder. This is absolutely ridiculous. Do you have any idea? Please don't make this difficult, Tyler interrupted. Just pack your things and go. More cars were pulling into the lot now. The raised voices had attracted attention from the breakfast crowd at the diner across the street. A small group of onlookers had begun to gather at the edge of the property. Marion touched Tyler's arm. Maybe we should discuss this in the office. No, Tyler said firmly. He needs to leave now. I've seen too many scams, too many weird situations. Better safe than sorry. Trump stood there, his face growing redder by the moment. In all his years through business deals, television shows, political campaigns, and even the presidency, he'd never been in quite this situation. The sheer absurdity of it was almost overwhelming. Listen, he began, trying to keep his voice level. There's clearly been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Tyler cut in, was us letting you stay here in the first place. I don't know who you really are, but… Who I really am? Trump's voice rose again. Who I really am. The small crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Someone had taken out their phone and was recording the confrontation. In the distance, a police siren wailed, though it was probably unrelated to the scene at the motel. Marion stepped between them. Gentlemen, please, we can resolve this civilly. Civilly? Trump was nearly shouting now. I've been accused of lying, told to leave, and treated like a criminal. And you want to talk about civil? More phones had appeared in the crowd. The morning sun was fully up now, illuminating the scene in harsh detail. The former president of the United States, his hair disheveled and his suit wrinkled, facing off against a young motel manager in the parking lot of the Pine Grove Motel. Sir, Tyler said, his voice firm but with a slight tremor, one last time, please leave or I'll have to call the authorities. That was the final straw. Donald Trump, who had built towers and hosted reality shows and served as the most powerful person in the world, drew himself up to his full height. His face was now the color of a summer sunset, and his eyes blazed with a familiar fire. You want to know who I am? He bellowed, his voice carrying across the parking lot and beyond. You want to know who you're trying to throw out of this establishment? The crowd had fallen silent. Even the car alarm in the distance seemed to hold its breath. I'm Donald J. Trump, former President of the United States of America. The words hung in the morning air like thunder after lightning. Marion's hand flew to her chest as recognition finally dawned. The crossword puzzle she was still clutching fluttered to the ground, landing in a puddle left by the night storm. Tyler's face went from determined to confused to horrified in the span of seconds. Oh no. And that's when Marion Wells, owner of the Pine Grove Motel for 30 years, did something she'd never done before. Her eyes rolled back, her knees buckled, and she fainted dead away in the parking lot of her own motel. The crowd gasped collectively. Tyler barely caught his grandmother before she hit the ground. And Donald Trump, still red-faced and disheveled, stood in front of room 114, watching as the gravity of the situation finally settled over everyone present. The morning had started normally enough at the Pine Grove Motel. It wouldn't end that way. Time seemed to freeze in the Pine Grove Motel parking lot. Tyler knelt on the wet asphalt, cradling his unconscious grandmother, while Trump stood awkwardly by his room door, his anger rapidly giving way to concern. Should we call an ambulance? Someone from the crowd called out. No, Tyler said quickly, patting Marion's cheek gently. She'll be okay. She's done this before, when the Eagles won the Super Bowl. Marion's eyes fluttered open, confusion evident on her face. What? What happened? Take it easy, Grandma, Tyler said softly, then looked up at Trump with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. Sir, I don't even know what to say. Trump's face had returned to its normal color, and something like amusement had crept into his expression. Well, this is certainly a first. By now, phones were out everywhere. The small crowd had doubled in size, with people from the diner across the street abandoning their breakfast to witness the scene. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as people whispered and pointed. Is it really him? Has to be. Look at the hair. Someone called Channel 5. I voted for him. I didn't, but oh my God. Marion struggled to sit up, Tyler supporting her shoulders. Mr. President, she said weakly, I am so sorry. So sorry. Grandma, careful, Tyler warned as Marion attempted to stand. Trump stepped forward, extending his hand to help her up. The crowd's excitement grew visibly at this interaction, phones recording every moment. Ma'am, Trump said, helping Marion to her feet, I've stayed in hotels all over the world. The Plaza, the Ritz, properties I owned myself. But I have to say, this is the first time I've ever made someone faint. A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. Marion smoothed her hair with trembling hands, her face flushed with embarrassment. I don't understand, Tyler said, still trying to process the situation. Why didn't you just tell us who you were last night? Trump adjusted his tie, a familiar gesture that made him look more like himself despite the rumpled suit. Sometimes, he said, it's interesting to see how people treat you when they don't know who you are. Though I have to admit, this wasn't quite what I expected. More people were arriving now. Someone had evidently called the local news as a van with WPEN News on the side pulled into the parking lot. A reporter jumped out, already fixing her hair and signaling to her cameraman. Mr. President, the reporter called out, pushing through the crowd. Jenny Chen from WPN News. Can you tell us what brings you to Pine Grove? Trump held up a hand. Before we do any of that, he said, turning to Marion and Tyler, I think we need to finish our discussion about my stay here. Marion looked mortified. Oh, you can stay as long as you want, Mr. President. Free of charge, of course. Grandma, Tyler whispered urgently, we should probably call someone, the police, or the Secret Service, or… Already taken care of, Trump said, gesturing to the street where a line of black SUVs had just turned into the parking lot. My security team finally caught up. They're probably not going to be too happy about all this. The crowd parted as several serious-looking men in suits approached, their expressions a mix of relief and concern. Mr. President, one of them said, reaching Trump's side. Are you all right, sir? I'm fine, Bob, Trump replied. Just had an interesting morning. Very interesting morning. The Secret Service agents quickly established a perimeter, pushing the crowd back to a reasonable distance. Jenny Chen from WPEN News was still trying to get closer, her cameraman filming everything. Marion had recovered enough to realize she was still standing in her morning house dress. I should change, she said weakly. Actually, Trump said, I could use a cup of coffee, and I believe there are some things we should discuss. He turned to the lead agent. Bob, give us a few minutes. The agent looked uncertain but nodded. Yes, sir. We'll secure the perimeter. As the crowd was moved back and the situation brought under control, Marion, Tyler, and Trump made their way to the motel office. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the same space where, just hours ago, none of them had any idea how their day would unfold. Tyler headed straight for the coffee maker in the corner, his hands shaking slightly as he prepared fresh coffee. Marion sank into her chair behind the counter, still looking dazed. Mr. President, she began, but Trump held up his hand. Please, he said, let me speak first. He pulled up a chair, sitting down with the kind of casual authority that had become his trademark. I've been in some unusual situations in my life, very unusual, but this, he gestured around the small office, this is something else. The coffee maker gurgled in the background as Tyler brought over 3 cups, his face still red with embarrassment. "Sir, about what I said earlier," Tyler started. "You were protecting your grandmother and her business," Trump interrupted. "I respect that. Always protect what's yours. That's what I've always said." Marion picked up her coffee with trembling hands. "But we treated you so. Normally?" Trump suggested, a slight smile playing at his corners of his mouth. "Do you know how long it's been since anyone treated me like a normal person? Years. Many years." Outside, they could hear the crowd still buzzing with excitement. Camera flashes occasionally lit up the windows, and the murmur of voices seemed to be growing louder. The crowd outside the Pine Grove Motel had swollen to nearly 100 people. News of Donald Trump's presence had spread through the small town like wildfire, and it seemed like half of Pine Grove's 2,187 residents were now gathered in and around the parking lot. Local police had arrived to help the Secret Service maintain order, though most of the crowd was simply standing around, phones raised, hoping to catch a glimpse of the former president. Inside the motel office, Marion Wells was still trying to process the events of the morning. She sat in her chair behind the counter, a fresh cup of coffee warming her trembling hands, while her grandson Tyler paced nervously near the window. "They're saying it's already on Twitter," Tyler said, scrolling through his phone. "Facebook too. Former president kicked out of small-town motel. We're going viral, Grandma." "Oh, Lord," Marion muttered, closing her eyes. "My bridge club is never going to let me live this down." Trump sat across from Marion, his own coffee untouched. Despite his rumpled appearance, he had regained much of his familiar commanding presence. "You know," he said, "this isn't actually the worst publicity you could get. Not the worst at all." A knock at the office door made them all turn. Bob, Trump's head of security, entered with a concerned expression. "Sir," he said, "we've got multiple news crews heading this way. CNN, Fox News, local affiliates. We should really think about moving you to a secure location." Trump waved him off. "In a minute, Bob. In a minute. Mrs. Wells and I are having a very interesting conversation." Marion flushed at being addressed directly. "Mr. President, I still can't believe. I mean, when you signed in last night, I should have realized." "The signature," Trump chuckled. "You know, I've signed thousands of documents, bills, executive orders. But that registration card might be the first time in years someone's actually looked at my signature and thought it was fake." Tyler had stopped pacing and now stood awkwardly by the coffee maker. "I still don't understand, sir. Why didn't you just tell us who you were when I confronted you?" Trump leaned back in his chair, a familiar glint in his eye. "You want to know something interesting? Very interesting. When you're in my position, everyone always knows who you are. Everyone. They treat you differently, act differently, talk differently. But last night," he gestured around the small office, "last night I was just another traveler caught in the storm. No special treatment, no security detail, no fancy suite, just room 114 and a vending machine that didn't like my dollar bills." Another knock at the door interrupted them. This time it was Jenny Chen from WPEN News, looking eager but professional. "Mr. President," she called through the glass, "we're live in 2 minutes. Could we get a statement?" Bob moved to intercept her, but Trump held up his hand. "Actually," he said, "I think we might have a better story for you." He turned to Marion. "That is, if Mrs. Wells is feeling up to it?" Marion's eyes widened. "Me? Oh no, I couldn't possibly. I mean, I'm not dressed for." "Grandma," Tyler interjected, "this could be good for the motel. Really good." Trump stood up, straightening his tie. "Mrs. Wells, would you like to tell America how you managed to kick Donald Trump out of your motel? It's a tremendous story, tremendous." Marion looked down at her coffee cup, then at her grandson, then back at Trump. A small smile began to form on her face. "Well, when you put it that way." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The Secret Service cleared a space in front of room 114, where Trump insisted the interview take place. Someone found Marion a proper jacket to wear over her house dress, and Tyler helped her fix her hair. "Live in 5, 4, 3. The cameraman counted down as Jenny Chen positioned herself next to Trump and Marion. Good morning, America. This is Jenny Chen reporting live from the Pine Grove Motel in Pennsylvania, where an extraordinary story unfolded this morning. With me are former President Donald Trump and Marion Wells, owner of this establishment. Mrs. Wells, can you tell us what happened here today? Marion froze for a moment, but then felt Trump's reassuring hand on her shoulder. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Well, it was raining something awful last night when he checked in. I was doing my crossword puzzle. 7 across was giving me trouble, and I didn't really look at him proper. Just another guest, you know? And then this morning. As Marion recounted the story, her natural charm began to shine through. She described the stormy night, the mysterious guest, her grandson's suspicions, and finally, the dramatic revelation in the parking lot. Trump occasionally interjected with his own observations, turning what could have been an embarrassing incident into an almost comedic tale of mistaken identity. And then, Marion said, her voice catching slightly, when he said who he was, well, I'm afraid I wasn't very ladylike. I just fainted dead away. Trump laughed, a genuine laugh that made the cameras flash even more frantically. Mrs. Wells here did something no opponent, no critic, no foreign leader has ever managed to do. She kicked Donald Trump out of her motel. The crowd watching the interview chuckled appreciatively. Marion blushed but continued smiling. Tyler, standing just off camera, couldn't believe how this disaster of a morning had somehow turned into whatever this was. Mr. President, Jenny Chen asked, what made you decide to stay at the Pine Grove Motel? Sometimes the best things in life are unplanned, Trump replied. Very unplanned. My plane had to land, my phone was dead, and I found myself here. And you know what? Despite the interesting wake-up call this morning, I have to say the Pine Grove Motel has something many luxury hotels don't have. And what's that, sir? Trump gestured to Marion and Tyler. Real people, good people. The kind of people who aren't afraid to stand up for what they believe in, even if it means telling the former president of the United States to leave their motel. Marion dabbed at her eyes with a tissue someone had handed her. Oh, Mr. President, when you put it that way. Mrs. Wells, Jenny Chen turned back to Marion. What would you say to other small business owners who might find themselves in a similar situation? Marion thought for a moment. Well, I suppose I'd say, always be kind to your guests, even if they look like they've been through a storm. And maybe, she glanced at Trump with a slight smile, maybe look a little closer at those registration cards. The interview continued, with more questions about the night's events, the confrontation, and the revelation. As they talked, the story seemed to take on an almost mythical quality. The night Donald Trump became just another traveler, and a small-town motel owner unwittingly stood up to one of the most powerful men in the world. Between takes, Trump leaned over to Marion. You're a natural at this, he said quietly. Very natural. Better than most politicians I know. Marion blushed again. Oh, I don't know about that. I'm just telling it like it happened. Sometimes, Trump replied, that's all you need to do. By now, more news crews had arrived. The parking lot of the Pine Grove Motel looked like a media circus, with satellite trucks, cameras, and reporters everywhere. Local restaurants had started delivering coffee and donuts to the crowd. Someone had even set up a makeshift merchandise stand selling hastily printed, I got kicked out of the Pine Grove Motel t-shirts. Tyler watched it all with a mix of amazement and concern. Grandma, he said during a break between interviews, are you sure you're feeling okay? We can stop this anytime. Marion patted his hand. I'm fine, dear. You know, I think this might be the most exciting thing that's happened in Pine Grove since they built the bypass in '86. As the morning wore on, the scene at the Pine Grove Motel began to take on an almost festival-like atmosphere. Local businesses, sensing an opportunity, started showing up with impromptu offerings. Jimmy from Jimmy's Diner brought over trays of his famous breakfast sandwiches. Sarah from the Pine Grove Bakery arrived with boxes of fresh donuts, including some hastily decorated with orange frosting in Trump's signature hairstyle. Mrs. Wells, Trump said, watching the growing crowd with amusement, I think you might need to start charging admission. Marion, who had finally changed into proper clothes, shook her head in wonder. I've never seen anything like this. Even when the governor stayed here in '92, it wasn't anything close to this. The governor stayed here? Trump asked, genuinely interested. Oh yes, during his campaign. Room 109. Marion pointed to a room 3 doors down from Trump's. Though he didn't get kicked out, she added with a small laugh. More reporters were arriving by the minute. Bob, Trump's head of security, approached with an increasingly worried expression. Sir, he said, Fox News is asking for an exclusive. CNN too. And there's a helicopter from Channel 7 circling overhead. Trump nodded, taking it all in stride. Tell them they'll all get their turn. This is Mrs. Wells's moment. Very special moment. Tyler, who had been monitoring social media on his phone, rushed over. Grandma, you're trending on Twitter. Pine Grove Motel is the #3 hashtag nationally. Marion looked bewildered. I'm what on where? You've gone viral, Mrs. Wells, Trump explained. Very viral. People love an underdog story, especially when the underdog wins. A local radio host had set up a remote broadcast from his car and was doing live commentary. And folks, if you're just joining us, we're live at the Pine Grove Motel where owner Marion Wells, a grandmother of 3 and longtime resident, accidentally kicked former President Donald Trump out of her establishment this morning. Stay tuned for more exclusive coverage. The noise from the crowd suddenly increased as several black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. Men in dark suits emerged, followed by several well-dressed individuals carrying briefcases. Oh boy, Trump muttered. The lawyers are here. Marion's face fell. Lawyers? Am I in some kind of trouble? Trump placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Not at all. Not at all. They probably just want to talk about merchandise rights, story rights, maybe a book deal. A book deal? Marion repeated weakly. How I kicked Trump out of my motel, it's got bestseller potential. Very big potential. Tyler, who had been watching the scene unfold, suddenly burst out laughing. Everyone turned to look at him. I'm sorry, he said, trying to compose himself. It's just. Grandma, remember what you said last week? About how nothing exciting ever happens in Pine Grove? Marion started to laugh too, and soon even Trump joined in. The cameras caught the moment, flashes going off like lightning as the former president and the motel owner shared an apparently hilarious private joke. One of the lawyers approached, carrying a thick stack of papers. Mrs. Wells, I'm David Cohen from... Later, Trump interrupted. Much later. Right now, Mrs. Wells is going to show me that breakfast place she recommended last night. The one that's better than the diner. Marion looked surprised. Oh, but surely you have to leave. I mean, with all these people waiting. They can wait, Trump said firmly. I missed dinner last night because of that vending machine. And I never got to finish my peanut butter crackers because your grandson here thought I was running some kind of criminal enterprise from room 114. Tyler had the grace to look embarrassed. About that, sir. Water under the bridge. Trump waved him off. Now, Mrs. Wells, about that breakfast. Bob stepped forward again. Sir, the security implications of... Bob. Trump cut him off. If Mrs. Wells can handle kicking me out of her motel, I'm sure she can handle showing me to a good breakfast place. Besides, he gestured to the crowd, I think we've established that there's no keeping a low profile anymore. And so, in perhaps the most surreal moment of an already surreal morning, Marion Wells found herself leading a procession down Pine Grove's main street. Trump walked beside her, asking questions about the town and its history, while their unlikely entourage followed. Tyler, Secret Service agents, news crews, and what seemed like half the town's population. Just wait until my bridge club hears about this, Marion said, more to herself than anyone else. Oh, they'll hear about it, Trump assured her. Everyone will hear about it. This is going to be a very big story. Very big. By early afternoon, the Pine Grove Motel had transformed into something unrecognizable. The parking lot, usually home to a handful of traveling salesmen's cars and the occasional tourist, now resembled a small media village. News vans lined the perimeter, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Secret Service agents maintained a careful watch over the premises. while local police directed the steady stream of curious onlookers. Inside the motel office, Marion Wells sat in her familiar chair behind the counter, but everything else about the situation was decidedly unfamiliar. Her crossword puzzle lay forgotten beside the register, and instead of her usual quiet afternoon routine, she found herself in the middle of what felt like a movie scene. Mrs. Wells, a representative from a major hotel chain, was saying, "We'd love to discuss a potential partnership. Your story has really captured the public's imagination." Before Marion could respond, another voice chimed in. "Don't forget our offer," said a publishing agent who had arrived an hour earlier. "We're talking full creative control, of course. The Night I Kicked Out Trump. It's got bestseller written all over it." Tyler, who had appointed himself his grandmother's impromptu business manager, was taking notes on everything. "We should probably talk to a lawyer before making any decisions," he said, showing more caution than he had earlier that morning. Trump, who had returned from breakfast and was now holding court in the corner of the office, laughed. "Smart kid. Very smart. Always get a lawyer. Then get another lawyer to watch the first lawyer." Marion looked overwhelmed. "I never thought I'd need a lawyer just for running my motel." "Welcome to my world," Trump said with a grin. "Very complicated world, but very interesting." The phone on the counter rang for what seemed like the 100th time that hour. Tyler picked it up, listened for a moment, then covered the receiver with his hand. "Grandma, it's Ellen. She wants you on her show tomorrow." Marion's eyes widened. "Ellen? Ellen DeGeneres?" "Actually, it's Ellen's producer," Tyler corrected. "They want to fly us both out to California, first class." "Oh my," Marion said faintly, reaching for her water glass. "I think I need to sit down, though I suppose I already am sitting down." Trump moved closer to her desk, his expression softening slightly. "You know, Mrs. Wells, you don't have to do any of this if you don't want to. You can tell them all to leave right now. Kick them out, just like you kicked me out." That got a laugh from Marion, which seemed to steady her a bit. "Mr. President, I have to ask, why are you still here? Surely you have more important things to do than sit in my motel office all day." Trump settled into the chair across from her desk, the same one he'd sat in earlier that morning. "You want to know something interesting? Very interesting? This morning, when everything happened, I could have gotten angry, could have made a scene. Many people would have. But instead, I saw something special happening." "Special?" Marion asked. "Very special. Here we are, in a small town most people have never heard of, in a motel that's probably never been on the national news, and suddenly, he gestured to the circus outside the window. Suddenly, we're making history. Small history, maybe, but history nonetheless." Tyler, who had finished taking down Ellen's producer's information, joined them. "But sir, doesn't it bother you? I mean, people are literally buying t-shirts about how you got kicked out of our motel." Trump laughed again. "Kid, I've had much worse things printed on t-shirts, much worse. But this?" He picked up one of the shirts someone had brought in earlier. "This is different. This is a real American story." "A real American story?" Marion repeated. "Think about it," Trump continued, warming to his theme. "A small business owner working hard every day, not afraid to stand up for what she believes in, even if it means confronting someone powerful. That's what this country is built on. Very much what it's built on." Through the window, they could see more people arriving, including what appeared to be a tour bus. "Oh dear," Marion said. "Betty from the diner just texted. She says they're completely sold out of food, and the gas station's running low on fuel from all the news vans." "Pine Grove's never seen anything like this," Tyler added. "Dad would have loved it." Marion's eyes misted slightly at the mention of her late son. "He certainly would have, though he probably would have recognized Mr. Trump right away. He never missed one of your shows," she added, turning to Trump. "The Apprentices?" "Loved it. Every episode. He used to practice saying, 'You're fired' in the mirror, though he could never quite get it right." Trump was quiet for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. He picked up the crossword puzzle that Marion had dropped that morning, now dried but still showing watermarks from the puddle it had landed in. "Mrs. Wells," he said, writing carefully on the paper, "I think this belongs in a frame." Marion took the puzzle with trembling hands. Above the half-completed crossword, Trump had written, "To Marion Wells, the only person who ever fired Donald Trump. Thank you for a very special story." "Oh," Marion said softly, her eyes welling up again. "Oh my." The door chimed as Bob entered the office. "Sir, we really should be going. Your schedule." Trump held up a hand. "One more thing first." He turned back to Marion and Tyler. "How would you two like to come to Mar-a-Lago as my guests, very special guests?" Tyler's jaw dropped. "Mar-a-Lago? Really?" "Really. We'll put you up in our best suite. No kicking out allowed," Trump added with a wink. Marion dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "That's very kind, Mr. President, but I don't know if I can leave the motel." "Grandma," Tyler interrupted, "I think after today, you can do anything you want." Trump stood up, straightening his tie. "He's right, you know, very right. And Mrs. Wells, one more thing." "Yes?" "Keep room 114 exactly as it is. Don't change a thing. Something tells me you're going to have people requesting that room for years to come." Marion laughed. "Even with the leaky faucet and the water stain on the ceiling?" "Especially with those. They're part of the story now, a very special story." The next few minutes were a whirlwind of activity as Trump prepared to leave. His security team had finally convinced him that he needed to get back to his schedule, but it seemed like everyone in the motel office wanted one last moment with him. He signed more T-shirts, posed for photos, and even recorded a quick video message for Marion's bridge club. Through it all, Marion sat at her desk, still clutching the signed crossword puzzle, watching as her small motel office continued to be the center of the universe for just a little while longer. As Trump finally headed for the door, he turned back one last time. "Mrs. Wells? Tyler? Thank you." "For what?" Tyler asked. "Kicking you out?" "For reminding me what it's like to be just another person caught in the rain. Very special feeling, very special indeed." And with that, Donald Trump walked out of the Pine Grove Motel office and into his waiting motorcade. The crowd outside cheered as the line of black SUVs pulled away, and gradually, the media circus began to pack up their equipment. Marion and Tyler stood in the doorway of their office, watching as their world slowly began to return to normal, or at least, what would now be their new normal. "Grandma?" Tyler said, picking up one of the "I got kicked out of the Pine Grove Motel" t-shirts. "I think we're going to need a bigger gift shop." Marion laughed, hugging her grandson close. "You know what, Tyler? Sometimes the craziest days turn out to be the most important ones." Above them, the Pine Grove Motel sign continued to flicker, just as it had the night before when a rain-soaked traveler had showed up looking for a room. But now, somehow, it seemed to shine just a little bit brighter.